IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I am here today with Pradeep. No one else has joined us from Takshashila. I think we are office pariahs now, considering we go so deep into the weeds of tech that I think we're the only ones left to talk about it. So keeping that in mind, we have this very sort of obsolete piece of news that no one has covered, and also which is extremely important today, which is that Russian iPhone buyers will soon be prompted to install software developed in that country, setting a precedent that other regimes might follow. What's basically happening is that users will see a screen that prompts them to install a list of apps from Russian developers. It's not just a regional peculiarity, it's a concession that Apple has made to legal pressure from Moscow, and one that could have implications far beyond Russia's borders. And Pratik, I want to start here, and then we'll talk about the Splinternet. But tell me a little bit about what's happening.
Yeah, so this actually goes back to 2019, where Russia essentially formulated these rules, which said that any hardware being sold in the country, now this was not restricted just to smartphones, included smart TVs, etc., had to have pre-installed applications embedded in them. Right now, what's happened recently? After that, there was obviously a battle between Russian government and Apple about how to implement this. Right, there was a back and forth. And what the most recent development, as of I think a week ago, is that they found some sort of middle ground in which Apple is basically saying that for new devices being set up, it's going to display a prompt which will allow users to, which will display to users a list of applications from Russia that they can install. Now, it's not mandatory at this point, and not all these applications are state made as such. But there are fears that this is going to lead to other countries putting more pressure on companies. Right? And again, but just to add some context, it's not the first time Apple itself has done something like this. They have made concessions in China when they moved a lot of iCloud hosting infrastructure for local China users into China. So they have they famously kicked out VPN apps from the App Store, etc. So they have made concessions like this in the past as well.
All right. I mean, I think when I basically look at this option of adding sort of pre-installed apps to phones, it's a little bit troubling to me because I feel like there are two basic things you can accomplish through this, right? Number one, it creates an opportunity to promote apps that the country can surveil and control. So I don't think I'd want to name names here, but state-controlled apps can be pretty handy tools of surveillance. And the other thing that I think this works really well for, it allows the government to manipulate the tech market. So basically have more homegrown alternatives, because if I generally have an app that I can't remove and it's been on my phone since day one, chances are I might give it a shot. I might not be regular at it, but I might give it a shot. And if the network effects are strong enough, I don't have a choice. So it sort of manipulates the tech market in that way, which is I don't know. Am I getting both of these things right, or are there other effects that I'm not seeing?
No, I think both of those are possible, but at this point, these kind of requirements are not yet widespread enough. I don't know if there's been enough research on this to actually, state that whether this will lead to distortionary effect in the market, in the marketplace, etc. Right? But I think as developments, they are certainly ones to be concerned about and watch closely, right? And again, these sort of things are not happening in isolation, right? Because on the one hand, you have Russia saying pre-installed, asking for pre-installed applications. Incidentally, around the same time in 2019, China had come up with a guidance saying that in 3 years they want all public institutions and government offices to get to move away from using foreign computing equipment, and in over 3 years, right? And I think they had split this over 30% of it to be 30% of this migration to happen in 2020, 50% in 2021, and the remaining 20% in 2022, right? Yeah, and then if you look at the fact that last year the US said they want to promote a clean network thing, right? So there is this growing tendency around the world to institute stricter controls of any form on the internet, and I think that's certainly a trend that we need to watch out for.
So this brings me to sort of the broader point of the stack. So generally, when I at least think about tech, I think about it in terms of a stack. So what I mean by that is if you've got an ecosystem. So like at the bottom of the stack, you've got something like electricity, okay, and then there's internet providers. On top of that, let's say you've got app stores, and then you've got the iPhones and so on. So like if you remove parts of the stack, or if you influence parts of the stack, for example, like telecoms are part of the stack, right? And it sort of feels like all these countries, Russia, China, of course, has done it for ages. India is also sort of manipulating the stack in a few ways. It's sort of troubling to me. So, for example, and I hope I'm pretty sure I'm butchering this name, but Roskomnadzor, Russia's internet and media regulator, fired off orders to TikTok, YouTube, and other foreign tech platforms, as well as VKontakte and other Russian social media platforms to remove information about demonstrations. These are, of course, demonstrations that have been happening in Moscow recently about what the political opponent that Vladimir Putin had, I imagine. And these demands of censorship were basically met with disturbing levels of compliance by these tech firms. And Moscow's also sent vaguely worded requests to Telegram to stop dissemination of personal data. And Telegram sort of has also complied. And there is also the internet regulator in Russia has throttled access to Twitter. It slowed down access, and the move seems to have backfired, as other websites, such as of those of Russian and American companies, the Kremlin, and both houses of the Russian parliament have become inaccessible. So, Pratik, talk to me about what's happening here, how sort of managing the stack can backfire, and should we be doing this in the first place?
Yeah, and this is not the first time that Russia has had challenges doing this, right? So a couple of years ago, they had tried to block Telegram, and it again that backfired because Telegram tried to evade their ban, and what Russia did was just try to mass block IP addresses, and in the process, I believe they blocked a bunch of Amazon Web Services IPs as well, which affected a whole bunch of websites across their accessibility in Russia. In this case, again, what's happened is that yes, they've gone for the technical intervention of trying to throttle it. Now, again, it seems that there were different theories about why this happened. I remember reading one explanation that said it was possibly a regular expression in the code that was gone wrong. Again, like we likely never know what the specific implementation issue was, but as you said, it resulted in a whole bunch of additional websites being blocked. Right now, the challenge with this is that these kind of blocks are not necessarily easy to enforce, and it's not necessarily that difficult to work around them. Right, a good example of this is even China. Right, for all their prowess of blocking internet content, you can still relatively easily work around with a lot of their blocks using VPN. Right, we saw that with the recent Signal block as well. Right, where I think a week or so ago, it was reported that Signal isn't working properly in China, and the way people tested this was accessing it without VPN and with a VPN to arrive at the conclusion that maybe China was doing something to block this. Right, and then of course you had researchers go in and determine in more detail what was actually going on with network data flows, etc. Right, but the other interesting thing about this Russia incident with Twitter is that, as you mentioned, right, there've been a bunch of warnings issued to other platforms as well. So it sort of displays a very hybrid approach that Russia takes. Right, it's a combination of digital and physical measures. Right? So you have courts issuing fines. Right, you have threats to individuals in the form of either putting them behind bars or some form of oppression. Right? There is harassment by various state agencies, etc. Right? So what you see there, it is not a purely technical intervention. It's a combination of both physical and digital interventions, right? Which is also a very very worrying trend. And some of those examples might have sounded familiar to us as well.
That's, I don't know. I don't know how to find the word for this. I feel like troubling's the one that I should go with. But I want to sort of build on this a little bit more and talk about countries sort of tackling stacks. We've also sort of had news that China has ordered all foreign computer equipment and software to be removed from government offices and public institutions within 3 years.
Yeah.
And China has also imposed new rules to restrict independent online content creators. This will require bloggers, influencers, and other content creators on public social media accounts. In China, they call it quote unquote self media to possess a government issued credential in order to publish anything on a host of topics. China has also sort of fairly been active in trying to build its own semiconductor industry. All of that sort of spells to me like China wants to control every element of the stack. On the other hand, and I think you talked about this with me before the podcast, there's this approach by Ben Thompson at StratSherry to talk about the different models of regulating the internet. So China seems to be basically regulate every part of the stack and see where it goes. He also talked about an Indian model of the internet, which I would like you to elaborate on. I think from my perspective, it's not so much as a model, it's just get companies to invest in Geo and hope that Geo then comes up with products in different parts of the stack. So talk to me about what China is doing and also about what this model approach is and whether it's feasible to apply it everywhere.
Yeah, so he broadly classified the internet into four models, right? And just to set some context, this was in the middle of 2020 when conversations about TikTok being blocked, etc., were highly prevalent, right? Not just in India, but there was a chance that the Trump administration in the US would take some action as well, right? So that's some of the context around this and whether that would lead to a splintering of the internet. Right? So he basically said that there were four models. The US model, which is more of a free flow of data across borders. A European model, which is based on trying to regulate aspects of the internet, right? The China model, which as you described, is essentially controlling as much as possible all the information that flows on the internet. And what he called the Indian model was essentially, again, I think you kind of summed it up well, right? In the sense that it sort of translated into tech companies investing in Geo and then Geo innovating in products across the stack, right? And as we were discussing, I don't think either of us see this necessarily as a model, especially equivalent to the other three that he described. But having said that, right, I think the broader point that he was also trying to make in that post was, of the Splinternet as such, is that this, in some form, the Splinternet has existed ever since China instituted very strong controls over its domestic internet. And the trend he pointed to was the fact that we're now seeing splintering in the non-China part of the internet as well, right? And a lot of this comes from, and this is, and I think it's closely linked to the concept of digital sovereignty as well.
All right. Let me sort of circle back to a more philosophical footing here, and you tell me if you agree with me. But I generally don't sort of. I find it hard to get on board with this approach that talks about models, right? So there's an India model, there's a China model, there's a US model, and there's an EU model. And to me, I mean, I don't think the world's as flat and predictable as a spreadsheet. I feel like it makes sense to have these buckets broadly, but how useful these buckets are going to be to understand how the world works. Because I feel like there's a lot more nuance to how these countries are going to govern the internet. For example, you've got Australia trying to get platforms to pay for the news. You've also got Signal that also cannot operate in Australia any further. I don't think you can call this an Australia model. I don't think that China itself thinks that there's a China model or the US thinks that there's a US model. They're just building it up as they go along. And we are trying to find these buckets to classify these approaches to sort of make some sense of them. Am I wildly off the mark here? Or am I sort of spot on in saying that these countries don't think there's a model and we're just trying to trying to overgeneralize?
I think it's actually a little bit of both, right? Look, why do you make, the idea behind the model is to try and understand some aspect of the real world, right? It is by definition reductive to some extent, because you're trying to, separate it from some of the harder nuances to just to try and understand how things happen. Basically giving you some sort of mechanism to predict what would happen or understand what would happen, right? So I mean that I think that criticism would apply to pretty much all sorts of models anywhere. Whether the countries themselves believe, in models, I think that again, there's not a single answer to that, right? It does seem like if you go back to there was this leaked set of, or this published set of documents from China. I forget whether they were called Document 9 or Document 13. But it basically sort of outlaid its vision for the internet, right? Now, whether they explicitly believe that's a model or not, but countries do have visions over how they want to govern parts of the internet, especially now, right? Especially in the context of how important the internet has become in terms of agenda setting or controlling narratives. It has become an area of focus, right, for many countries to govern or control information flows on the internet. They have different ways of doing that, right? And it's not always possible to put them into neat buckets, because, for example, right, it's very tempting to say, okay, you have one model which liberal democracies use, one model which authoritarian regimes use. But incidentally, I think the precursor for a lot of the draconian anti-disinformation laws that you see today, it's essentially, a lot of it goes back to NetCG in Germany, right? Now, was Germany necessarily looking at clamping down on all forms of information flow and narratives back then? I would say no, right? But it has been used by various countries and then expanded after that, and built on to become more draconian, more extreme, and we're seeing versions of that around the world today.
All right. I think I have a couple of questions before we wrap up. And the first one is, having said all of this and talked about the Splinternet, I want to sort of find out where India's new internet intermediary rules fit into here, because they sort of seem awfully similar to that Chinese provision we were discussing about influencers getting licenses. There's that. And also, like, finally, where do you see this going forward? Do you think there is a model that we will all eventually end up at, or are we just going to make it up as we go along? So, like, basically, what is the future of this internet, and like 10 years down the line, how are we going to think about this? So, yeah.
Crystal ball gazing, I love that. No, but seriously, right? So in its most extreme form, right, the vision of the Splinternet is that you will have, there will be no global internet. There will be a bunch of national internets or intranets which are cut off from each other, etc. I'm skeptical that that's going to become a reality anytime soon. A lot of it is also based on the fact that the way infrastructure is designed today, it doesn't really respect physical borders, etc. Right? But having made that last point, just because it doesn't respect physical borders today doesn't mean it cannot be reshaped in that mold in the future. Right? But overall, I'm still a little skeptical that we will reach a model of the Splinternet where each country is going to be completely cut off from the other. I think what is more likely to happen is that, while information flows across will still happen, they will get more restricted. What you see in different countries will differ. A lot of it defined by local laws, or at least ostensibly defined by local laws. And that's where it's going to get really tricky, right? Because like I said, governments are trying to impose more control over the internet within their national boundaries. Now, you can argue that there is a case for them to do that. At the same time, we're also seeing that under the guise of doing that, there is also a lot of abuse of that power happening in various countries as well, right? And a lot of this is backed by this by these conversations for the need for digital sovereignty, right? Which I was just reading a paper recently by two researchers in Germany. I will link, we can link to that. They broadly identify three types of digital sovereignty conversations. Right? One is based on state autonomy and national security. I think that's something we're all familiar with, where we're talking about the fact that the country should be able to control what's happening within its borders on the internet, control of police. Interestingly, they point two differing approaches to this. One was where states have seen network communication as a threat, and then have tried to clamp down on it, which is more of your China model. And the other is your slightly more open model, where you're looking at it more from a defensive security perspective. You recognize that this openness comes with vulnerabilities, and you're trying to address that. And in the process of addressing that, you can end up with measures that seem to be controlling and based on surveillance. The other conversation that they identified was based on economic autonomy and competition. Right? Again, this is from the perspective that you want to reduce your dependency on foreign technology and service providers. And the last one was based on user autonomy and user self-determination, right? Which is slightly distinct from the first two, in the sense that it doesn't center the country; it focuses on an individual or a citizen. But I think one slight drawback that they identified was that it tends to look at an individual as a consumer, and in the process you can misdiagnose certain issues. Right. I want to go back to your question about India, right? And there's a slight distinction there. So while Chinese rules on self-media, right, require any sort of require government credential for any sort of discussion on current affairs or news or politics, etc. In India, it's not yet at the point where you require government credentials. Yes, digital news organizations have been asked to register with the government and follow the Press Council of India code, right? But it's not apples to apples the Chinese mechanism yet. Having said that, as you're all aware, those rules are being challenged in court. So we'll have to see what becomes of them. So while they are concerning, and we did a whole episode on that, it's not quite the China approach yet.
All right. On that very optimistic note that India is not China yet, I think we can end this podcast. Thank you, Prateek, so much for joining us. Have a nice week ahead.
Right. Thanks.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, Siet Tires and The Whole Truth Foods. We really appreciate your support. So, on Cyrus Says, Sagarika Ghost, journalist, columnist, author, discusses books she has written, her experiences from reporting about the Babri Masjid demolition back in the day, and the upcoming state election. Cyrus also had a great episode with Devdutt Patnaik last week. Do check that out. Chuck narrates an interesting story about a company that shared its virtual expertise with other companies and empowered the virtual world. No, we're not going to tell you what the brand is, but go check out The Origin of Things. And Chuck also came back on Simplified this week. From episode 200 onwards, he's back. Go check that out if you haven't had a chance to do so far. The Habit Coach Ashton was joined by Sapna Gopalkrishnan, his co-trekker on Mount Kilimanjaro. They recollect the trek's memories, and Sapna talks about the challenges she faced. On All Things Policy, Rachit Sheth talks to Sarthak Pradhan about Delhi's water crisis. This is due to the pollution of its major water source, the river Yamuna, and he discusses the case against the state of Haryana. We had Manish Dangi, Chief Investment Officer of the Aditya Birla Sun Life Mutual Fund, on Paisa Vaisa with Anupam Gupta. They discussed India's financial report card with reference to the past decade, the hits and misses, and what the future of investing is going to look like. And with that, we hope to see you again next week.
Working Monday to Friday glued to your chair making you feel dull? Worry not. Get your 5-minute weekly dose of travel around the world with postcards from nowhere. Join me every Thursday as I explore the strange, obscure, and fascinating parts of the world and bring out facets of travel you may not have thought of before. You can find us on the IBM Podcast app, website, or wherever you get your podcast from.